Welcome to The Check-In, a podcast by Telos, where we explore the headlines from Israel, Palestine, and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David Cadbot, checking in from Washington, D.C. In today's show, we chat with our friend, author, preacher, trainer, liturgist, activist, Sandra Van Opstal. Sandra is a Chicago-born, second-generation Latina and a leading practitioner of multi-ethnic worship. She's passionate about creating atmospheres that mobilize for reconciliation and justice, and now serves as the co-founder and executive director of Chasing Justice, a movement led by people of color to mobilize a lifestyle of faith and justice in the American church. As a faith leader crossing generational, racial, and ethnic and other lines of difference, Sandra shares with us what it looks like to be an effective advocate for our friends in Israel, Palestine, especially in this horrific moment that we all find ourselves in. In fact, Sandra had never even visited the region prior to this past May with Telos, but she has since committed herself to the work of owning her agency and responsibility, which is one of our practices of peacemaking. In fact, she has recently returned from another trip to the region where she attended the And Still We Rise conference, put together by our friends at CMEP, a conference intentionally created by and for women. In this conversation, we cover her experience at that conference, especially what it was like standing in solidarity with her Palestinian sisters in faith. We also talk about what it means to be an effective ally, advocate, and friend, why it's so important to center women in leadership and movements for social change, and what collective flourishing, one of Chasing Justice's taglines, might mean in actuality for the Holy Land. My colleague and host of the Learning Core podcast, Sarah Strum, co-hosted this episode with me in our DC office, and we hope you enjoy. Well, thanks for joining us, Sandra. It's so good to have you on the show and to be doing this with my colleague, Sarah, co-hosting the check-in. I think this is the first time we've technically co-hosted together.
I think that's right.
Yeah. But we met you, Sandra, I guess more than a year ago at the CCDA conference. We had a great conversation, and you have been a huge supporter of our work over the past year. You've even visited the region with Telos. So we're so grateful to have you and to be in conversation with you about the work that you do at Chasing Justice, about the activism and engagement you've had on this issue, in particular, Israel-Palestine, over the past year. So thanks for being with us. Where are you checking in from today?
I'm checking in from the west side of Chicago where I live, and it's freezing here. So I hope it's better wherever you all are listening from. But the winter has caught up with us. But yes, here I live on the west side. I neighbor here. I've pastored here over a couple decades. And that's where I'm at.
It's funny talking to you both because I know Sarah loves the winter and you're in Chicago, which is a place that I could never live personally because I hate wearing layers and layers of winter clothes. It just it's so onerous to me. My colleagues and roommates have already heard me complain about taking on and off the gloves and the scarves and the jackets. But I am curious, for both of you who are winter people, what is your favorite piece of winter clothing?
I have to go with the cozy, chunky, hand-knit, warm sweater that is not flattering, but just makes you want to feel like you're inside all day after you come in from the cold, and it's like a hug in a garment.
Do you make your own sweaters?
I've made two. It's a sore subject. I'm a slow knitter when it comes to big projects. The first one turned out way too big, but we're aspiring.
Sarah's an amazing quiltist. Is that the word? Quilter?
I'd go with quilter.
Quilter. So I would not be surprised if she made her own sweaters, but that's amazing. Sandra?
I hate winter clothing. I'm with you, David. I'm like, no. So I rarely even wear a jacket. I'm kind of like a teenager on the west side. None of our teenagers wear jackets. They wear hoodies and they call that a jacket. But I don't like layers. I don't like feeling constrained by zipped up coats. It's going to be a hard pass for me. So I'm going to say indoor slippers. I have a pretty strong slipper game. So I've got some great slippers, all kinds, padded, not padded, fuzzy, not fuzzy. So inside the house, because we have wooden floors and we keep the heat at 65 because we don't like to pay a lot of money. So I got to have some good slippers. So I'm going to say that.
That is an excellent answer. Indoor shoes are everything for sure. I'm with you. I have two pairs, but I that's the kind of piece of clothing that I would buy more of if I just, wanted to.
I also come from a culture where you take off your shoes at the door. So you have to have slippers. So we also have like whole racks of slippers for our guests that, like we used to have a huge small group and we would like put all the slippers out. People would have their names on them. And so that we would have to wash them every time. They just put their names on the bottom of the slippers. And then we have the other guest slippers that people could, wash and wear. But we don't do shoes in the house. So nope.
For sure. I'm with you. And also, guest slippers are, to me, a sign of true hospitality. Like, I never feel more cared for than when I come to home and I want to take my shoes off, but it's hard floors. I don't, maybe I'm not wearing socks, but there's slippers.
Or they don't match.
Yeah. Wow. Absolutely. I get that a lot. That's amazing. Well, Sandra, we would love to hear more about who you are, what's your story, how you got into doing the work that you're doing today. You're in Chicago. You love wearing slippers. What else we need to know about Sandra?
Yeah, so I am the daughter of two immigrants. My mom came from Colombia, South America, my father from Argentina, and they met here in Chicago learning to speak English. And so they met in kind of ESL classes, and that's where the story begins. So I think being a part of an immigrant family and living in an immigrant community has deeply shaped how I understand the world, how I understand scripture, how I understand my role in the world. So I would say that's what I love people to know about me, is that I am a person that's used to living in liminal spaces, like in between cultures. And so, yeah, my first language was Spanish. I had to learn to speak English in about second grade when we moved to a neighborhood that didn't have as many options for schooling in bilingual settings. I'm a pastor. I'm an author. I'm a mom of two young boys. And I raise chickens. So those are all the things you probably need to know about me. The rest you can see in a bio somewhere, but those are the things I think occupy my mind.
I love that. The most important pieces to know about you, not just your resume, but what makes you you as a person. One of the many reasons we were so excited to have you on as a guest for this podcast today is that you just got back from the region and you had joined a conference called And Still We Rise, which is a conference put on by Churches for Middle East Peace that is intentionally created by and for women. And we'd love to hear about that experience, what you saw, what you felt, what you heard, anything that you'd love to bring back and share with our listeners from that experience of, I'll call it radical solidarity.
Yeah, so I was there in early November, and Still We Rise is a space that creates it's a community that creates a safe space for women to build community, to invite transformation, and to take action, kind of all those things. And I had first gotten involved in And Still We Rise actually in DC, in Washington, DC, I think in 2018. I can't remember the year exactly. I had led worship for the community. There were different speakers that were standing in solidarity with what was happening. This is, again, many, many years ago. And the reason I got involved actually was because I was in DC very often addressing the issue of child separation from migrant parents. And so here I was as a pastor in a primarily immigrant community dealing with the impact of families that were seeking refuge and seeking asylum and desperate for home as families. And they were experiencing, many people in our congregation, in our community were experiencing the longing for reunification with families after children had been separated from their parents and parents from their children. And so I was processing that. And alongside of that, I was invited to participate in this And Still We Rise, looking at the conflict in Palestine, Israel. And so what I learned was that a lot of what was happening with child detention in the region there was similar and parallel to what was happening with child detention at our borders. And I realized that, wow, there's a lot of overlap between marginalized communities. And I wonder if there's a way that we can stand with one another, advocate for one another, and address the core issues that are impacting both of our communities. And so that's how I got involved many, many years ago. In November, I went back because I had gone in May with Telos, and I had tried for so many years to go and learn and be with my siblings particularly in Palestine, and the folks that were doing peacemaking across differences. And for some reason or another, I could never make it. I mean, literally, I signed up so many times. Once I almost boarded a plane, but the day before things got canceled. I mean, it was like I wasn't going to go. And so when the opportunity came in May to go, I decided, yes, this is the time to go. And it profoundly changed the way I understood what was happening there. And then in November, when I went back, I was going primarily as a sign of solidarity, but also to communicate my commitment to being involved when the news cycles pass. And I felt very strongly that as an international leader, I had a few opportunities to do different international conference type things. And I decided that I was going to not go to the ones that most of my friends were going to, but that instead I was going to place myself in a space and place that people had maybe already forgotten because it had already been a year. And when I was there, I was like, yep, this was the right choice. I needed to be here. I needed to hear this. I needed to know this. I needed to feel this. So that's why I went back, was because, news cycles, they move on. There's a lot happening in the world. And it's very easy to bounce from one issue of injustice to another and not really stay the course and make change in one area.
I think that's really profound, Sandra, because that's what true solidarity looks like. And it requires our ongoing participation and focus as allies and advocates across the world on behalf of our siblings who are experiencing, still to this day, some of the most unimaginable violence. So it's really encouraging to hear that you did that, and that also it was a choice that continued to feel like the right one once you were there. And I'd love to surface some of those things that that helped resonate or confirm that choice for you when you were there, when you were in conversation with particularly these Palestinian women, when you were leading worship and thinking about what does it look like to be, an advocate that stays the course. What were some of the stories that maybe stand out to you that you're still thinking about and reflecting on from your experience there?
So there was a moment in worship when we were singing the Lord's Prayer, and I don't speak Arabic at all. Like I can sing it, but I don't speak it. And not yet, but I've been doing Duolingo. So I'm going to be better next time I go. And so we were singing the song in Arabic that is a very familiar Lord's Prayer. And it was taught to me by someone, I think in Egypt, and then reinforced by a friend who's Syrian. So I know it's sung in the region. And so I sang it in English because that's how I know it, with the tune that is obviously coming from the region. And I began to hear the women's voices in Arabic, like just sing over me. And so they began to carry the song. And I remember having that moment in the song where, it's 100 women singing in Arabic the words of the Lord's Prayer. And what does it mean to be a woman in Palestine and pray for your daily bread? And what does it mean to be a woman in Palestine and pray for the power and the strength to forgive those who sin against you? And what does it mean to be a woman in that context and long for God's kingdom to come and God's will to be done on earth? And so I remember that moment thinking I just really needed to be here for my understanding of what we pray as Christians to be deepened, and for me to feel their feelings and to be in the moment, to hear them and see their faces when they're singing the words. So there's this one moment where in the song, it kind of goes up melodically. And when it says, that we would be able to forgive those who sin against us. And I saw their faces and I was like, oh, that feels hard. And yet it's in the song and it's in the prayer. So we have to pray it. So I think that was one moment where I felt like I need to be here, because sometimes even in my difficult context here on the West Side, I don't fully understand what it's like to live out that prayer in ways that other people do. So I would say that's one thing. There were many times. And then when I came back, I told my husband, I was like, I'm so glad I went. I'm so glad I went. I needed to go. And so I could speak of probably 8 others, but that was one moment that I think it's important when we worship together and when we pray together, that we're in space together, that we not only understand cognitively and mentally what's going on, but that we feel the weight of someone else's prayer.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's incredibly powerful. And I got chills when you were describing that feeling of getting to sing in solidarity from different contexts and sitting in that space, not knowing how to fix it or how to take away that pain, but just being present to it and open to it. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about what you shared is that it's a conference buy-in for women in Palestine, which is something that's pretty unique, not just in Palestine, but in a lot of advocacy, activist, religious spaces. And so that power of solidarity and presence feels like it's something that's transformative in and of itself. And one of the pieces I wanted to ask you about, Sandra, is one of the incredible opportunities of nonviolent resistance movements, and I'd put this as part of that, is that they can change both external systems of injustice, what you were describing with women praying for their daily bread, right? Needing to forgive or being asked to forgive systems of oppression and power. But they can also change internal societies, especially around gender and the role women play. And I'm wondering if there's any insights you have from this experience that you can share with us around how women's participation in nonviolent movements or creating nonviolent spaces transforms not just external structures, but also internal cultures and societies and spaces in a way that make these movements liberatory, not just in one area or one sense, but in a way that really, expounds beyond one specific context or moment.
That's a whole thesis in and of itself. But I think I can answer a few ways I've seen this, not only in this context, but in my own. I mean, women are just at the center of every movement of change. They just always are. The problem is the story gets told, and the heroes in the story are typically men. So one hero is pulled out. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., amazing man, amazing person, amazing prophet. But there was a whole crowd of women up in those spaces that were doing things. And so I think it's important for us to understand that the hero gets to tell the story. The people with power get to tell the story. And so if we were to look at movements of peacemaking and nonviolent resistance and resilience and change and flourishing in communities globally, you'd see that women are always at the center of that. I think of even in our own community here, we had a pretty large incident happen here in Chicago where the government was taking all the money, the tax dollars that were coming from this Mexican community where all of this income was being created through shopping, because it was the second highest grossing income in the city of Chicago next to Michigan Avenue was 26th Street in La Villita in a Mexican community. And they took all those tax dollars and they moved it to build this school for the South Loop for people that are wealthy. And then the grandmas in the community said, I don't think so. Like, that money belongs to us. That resource belongs to us. It was created here in our community and it's going to stay here. And so they fasted and they prayed and they sat on that property for 40 days and they went on a hunger strike. And it was their resistance and their prayers and their songs and their presence that actually moved the dial on it. And so I think of things like that where I'm like, oh, it was the abuelas, it was the grandmothers, the titis, the aunties, that are finding a different way of subverting power and of speaking to power that isn't always confrontational, head-to-head argument, power with power. In that sense, it's a new way. And so I think of that example. And I know there's tons of examples like that within the Palestine-Israel community from our trip in May, where I saw the parent circles and what parents are doing to have conversation with one another and shape. And then I think also in many of our cultures still globally, women are the one that control the culture in the household. And so they raise the children. And when I think about myself as a woman who's raising two young men, I'm like, oh, they're going to do it right when they grow up. They're going to have it. So I remember my son when they're 10 now, but one of my sons when he was like 5, he's like, oh yeah, the bee. We were talking about bees. And he's like, oh yeah, the bee is the queen. Like all the animals, like the lioness is the queen. And he starts talking about all these, because the queen, she's in charge. And then he says, that's why mama's in charge, because she's the queen, and then Bob was like, well, she's not in charge. We're both in charge. But so in his mind, the way that society runs is that the queen bee is the one that runs the society, So he has a more egalitarian way of seeing the way the world runs. So I think there are ways that women nurture and create culture within the home in majority world context that is very crucial to the future. Imagine mothers who are helping children in Gaza process what is happening for them right now. When those young boys and girls turn 20, 25, they will be adults who have been shaped by how their parents process what they're going through right now. That's a lot of power.
That's such a good word, Sandra. And it makes me think about all of the ways in which particularly masculinity in our culture is understood and conceived of and passed on to generations in ways that perpetuate these kinds of spirals of violence when women are not centered in these conversations. One of our practices of peacemaking is centering the leadership of the marginalized, which is part of this work that's happening is really centering not just conversations about women, but women at the table in deciding what their futures look like. And it makes me think about also kind of something you mentioned earlier about what solidarity across lines of difference looks like. I mean, you coming into this community in Palestine, not being from there, but recognizing you have an opportunity and partially even a responsibility as an American citizen, as a Christian, to be in solidarity with these communities, knowing that you can't also speak for them. But I'm curious, what does it look like? If you could talk more about that question of what does it look like to be an effective advocate across lines of difference, both across national or ethnic lines of difference in this context, but even for men listening to this conversation, what does it look like to continue to center leadership of women in these movements and other movements?
I think advocacy and solidarity and allyship is best practiced when you know yourself and you know your experience well. So one of the guides that Chasing Justice has put together is an allyship guide. And the first principle of that guide is to know yourself. And it is because you need to know where you're standing in order to know what it's like to stand with somebody else. If I'm a person who, for example, carries the privilege of documentation and can come and go from state to state and country to country with no problem, then I'm going to say, oh, well, let's just go and deal with things this way, with the kind of freedom and mobility that most people in my community don't have and most people in the world don't have. To advocate well, to be an ally for real, to stand in solidarity in a way that is effective and long lasting, you have to know your own position. Like, what are my beliefs? What are the narratives that I'm carrying? What values do I have? What cultural instincts am I operating out of? What privileges do I have that other people don't have? And I think when you can name those and you can say, oh, okay, I see where I'm located now, and I see what I believe, and I see how my beliefs and the environment that I've in has shaped me the way that I am. So now I can learn to cross that cultural or value barrier or boundary or bridge and get to you and understand you better. And so I think knowing yourself is the beginning place of that. And then proximity, standing, being present with others is the next thing that you do. Good listening. I know those are your principles as well. Like listening to, like we have in CCDA, listening to the community, like listening well, asking good questions, operating out of humility and curiosity, especially when someone says something that you're like, whoa, no. And I would say that's true, especially around gender, because Americans and Westerners have very strong perspectives on gender. And sometimes we impose those on other places that don't see gender the same way. And we see behavior and we assume the value or the principle they're behaving out of. And then we impose our behaviors on them. And so I think it's just really hard when you're working across cultures to not do that. So I think the first two steps would be to know yourself and then to be in proximity with the people you're trying to work alongside of. You really have to work with them, not for them. And so being with someone assumes that you're listening to them, you're leaning in, you're operating out of curiosity. And when you want to correct or argue about something, that maybe you'd ask some questions instead.
love everything you just said, especially the piece around curiosity and humility. I think that's an invitation for us as we know ourselves, as you said, or as we self-interrogate, to use the language of our practice. And as we engage others, listening to understand, right? Coming back to that curiosity and humility, trying, making the effort, stepping forward, and then also being willing to take feedback and assess where we maybe have fallen short or need to keep working so that we're able to do this work really effectively. I'd love to turn the conversation back to some of the work you do in the US as well, thinking about what you described, right? The similarities between children on our border being separated from families and children in Palestine being separated from families through childhood detention. There are so many issues and contexts that have similarities that hopefully inform each other as we all engage in the work of collective liberation. But I'd love to hear more about the work you're doing, leading a movement for social justice among especially young Christians of color called Chasing Justice. Can you share a little bit more about your work and how, if it's changed at all, how it's changed in light of the past 14 months in Israel-Palestine and some of your experiences stepping out of your context, learning from another, and then coming back home?
Well, I started Chasing Justice. I'm the founder of Chasing Justice along with a group of friends and the executive director of the organization. And the idea really was, wow, people really want to change the world. And people really love Jesus. The problem is they can't figure out how to change the world rooted in the fact that they love Jesus. And the reason was because, like many of us, for myself as a pastor, for others as activists, the idea of like Christian faith or worship connected with activism did not make sense to them, which is incredibly odd to me as a person who comes from a culture where the church was very involved in creating change in the community and in the world. And I'm assuming for Black Christians, knowing the civil rights movement, which was really fueled by the spirituality of the Black church. And so this moment that we found ourselves in 2020 was like, the data's showing me that young Christians want to make a difference in the world of every culture and ethnicity, not just the BIPOC ones, but all of them. And they're trying to figure out how. And a lot of the justice movements and reconciliation movements are being led by white folks that are trying to get their white friends to care about issues of justice. But that's just not where we're at. We already know there's injustice in the world. We've experienced it in our own homes and communities and from our position. And so what would it look like if there was a movement of justice and Christian formation that was led by people of color, but it was for like us and our friends. So people that we didn't have to convince to make a difference in the world, people that wanted to, but that they would be led by us. And so Chasing Justice ended up being this community of faith formation and mobilization for young Christians of color and their allies, their friends who are allies. So we always say it's everything is written by and messaged by and created by people of color, but it's for everybody. We feel like we should be leading in the things that are most impacting our communities. And so that's how Chasing Justice started. And really it is a discipleship movement. It's forming Christians to understand that our love for Jesus and our love for neighbor can be done together. And I know it sounds silly, like thinking about it since it's like in the scriptures, but that how we vote matters, that how we show up in our community matters, that how we spend our money and where we spend our money matters, that where we choose to live and who we choose to live next to matters. All of that matters for shaping our lives, but also for the kind of future that we want to have. And so what it looks like is we have a podcast and we have cohorts of leaders that are learning together, and we have guides that we create, and we have digital content that we put on, and we have master classes that we do with kind of education and informing and connecting people who all want to make a difference in the world because they feel their faith compels them to. And the ultimate goal of all that is that we would experience our collective flourishing, that because we're doing that, that my flourishing is connected to your flourishing and our flourishing is connected to our neighbor's flourishing. And that if we work together as people of faith, we can actually change the world.
Sandra, that's such a powerful invitation. And I love the way that you are embodying this work of centering the leadership of the marginalized, but doing it within a lens of this is for everyone's liberation, everyone's flourishing, everyone's dignity being honored, because none of us get to flourish when any of us are facing injustice, right? Which I think is so core to our philosophy and yours as well. And thinking about that phrase, collective flourishing, which I love just so much, also in the context of your new experiences in Israel Palestine and the things that you saw, the relationships you formed, and even how those communities are so deeply affected by our decisions, our cultures, our policies here in the United States. I'm wondering if how that has your experiences there have shaped your understanding of this vision of collective flourishing. And then maybe even in this context, as Americans begin to wake up to this, as Christians begin to wake up to this long-standing conflict and injustice, what collective flourishing looks like for our friends in Palestine and Israel, and even here at home as we look towards this vision of something more and something whole. Can you just kind of paint that picture a little bit for us?
As Americans, probably anyone in the West, but as Americans in particular, I think it's important for us to recognize that the decisions that we make affect not only the people around us, but people and communities around the world. And we need to make choices with that in mind. I learned that when we went in May. I knew that already as a person that's like connected to Latin America, but when I went in May and I heard over and over and over again from our Israeli and Palestinian, Christian and Muslim and Jewish brothers and sisters, we will be at war as long as you want us to be at war. Over and over again, they said that. We will be fighting as long as American Christians want us to be fighting. It was very specific. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, like, I don't know why it surprised me, but yes, absolutely. We have the power to stop this. We have the power to create a ceasefire to cause that. And so the work is probably more important when I go home afterwards, that I raise my voice to my elected officials, that I help people to interrogate the narratives they have theologically around Israel, Palestine. Not that we don't center scripture, but that we understand what cultural values and political ideas we're putting into scripture that were not there. And so as a theologian, as a content creator, as a pastor, as a parent, I'm thinking like, what does it mean for me to invite people to be a person of peace and collective flourishing in the context of Israel, Palestine, when our brothers and sisters over there are saying, please make this stop? Because it's your funding and your bombs and your decisions that are making this happen. On both sides, they were saying that, peacemakers on both sides. And then when I came back in November, I mean, I took a lot of notes. And when I came back, it was the same. People were saying things like, you're complicit in this. Like, you come here to stand in solidarity with us. You come here to visit us. But the reality is we need you to go back home and do something about your neighbors and how they're voting and what they're saying and what they're doing. And I was like, oh, okay. And it wasn't like out of anger. It was out of desperation. Like, I want to say, particularly in November, and I know I shared this with you all, but privately, but particularly in November, what I heard was a helplessness and a desperation and a hopelessness around what was happening, because that had been so long. And yet the people that call themselves our siblings in Christ are not relieving us from this suffering. And so when I think about solidarity and collective flourishing and mutual flourishing, I think we need to, as humans, understand how our decisions impact people all around the world. And as we make decisions, we have them in mind, and we have those things in mind.
I'm so glad you named that complicity, Sandra, because I think the idea of complicity can be incredibly heavy. None of us want to own it. None of us want to think that we are part of the problem. But with complicity also comes opportunity to own our agency and to work for change, right? It doesn't absolve us of that complicity, but it lets us harness that agency and engage our communities. As you were describing, we all have unique access to our friends, our churches, people who listen to us in a way that is built on the relationships we've built with them. So we can bring the stories like you heard in November and May, like we've heard through these podcasts, or if you've been on a trip with us, back to our communities. So we can own our agency, not feel helpless about the fact that we are complicit, but really use it to motivate us to work for that collective flourishing so that we play a part, not just in the violence, but in the liberation from that violence.
Yeah, and to sit with that, and to sit with their emotions and feelings and the reality of what they're saying, and like you said, it provides an opportunity. Like when I was in that room with these pastors and civic leaders from all over the region, gathered that evening, the first night I was there, and I heard multiple young leaders in their 20s say, if I had an opportunity to leave, I wouldn't need to think about it. I would be out of here. I don't have a reason to stay. And they love their family and they love their country. And like we're seeing even now in Syria, like nobody wants to be a refugee. Everybody wants to live. And that's why they're all driving back. People want to be with their family and in their space and place that they call home. And yet these young people are saying, like, there's just nothing for me here, with tears and desperation in their eyes. I would leave if I could. To me, it resonates with what I hear in other spaces and places where there's injustice, like Native American young people who are like, I don't want to stay here. Kids on the West Side that are like, I don't want to raise my family in this setting. I want to give them more, I want to take them to the white suburbs, because there's opportunities in schools and growth and a future. Here, there's no future. So imagine that people are saying that about the very place they love. So that really struck me personally, that if young people in a neighborhood here in the US, or if young people in a city in Palestine don't want to stay, where's the future of that city when the resources, the ideas, the energy, and the future leaves? And so, yeah, I was thinking about that. Like, what does flourishing look like for them if people leave?
Mm.
What does flourishing look like for the West Side if all of our children leave?
That's a powerful question for us. It's a difficult question. And I think of this line that we often say that, our futures are intertwined. I think you even said it earlier in the show. And if there's no future in our neighbor's community, there's no future for us either if our futures are intertwined, right? And so this vision of collective flourishing and mutual flourishing is building a world in which everyone has a future where they call home, and that no one has to leave their home to find a quote better future. So what a powerful invitation for us, and especially for you, Sandra, to have this experience where you went, you visited, you bore witness to the realities and especially to your own complicity. And you said, I'm not going to let it stop there. I'm going to keep investing. I'm going to keep paying attention. I'm going to keep showing up in relationship and in listening and in speaking up for this community that I now know and now love and am connected to. And ultimately, that's our hope for anyone who goes on a Telos trip, for sure, but even all of us who are paying attention in the past year, that we would bear witness and then respond in ways that are true solidarity. And so thank you for the work that you're doing. It's an inspiration and encouragement to us. And it's a challenge to continue to step in, to lean in to the difficult work that this requires, the patient work that this requires, and the work of grief that this requires too. But there's a possibility to imagine something new here for all of us. And that's our work, is to imagine and enact that out as well. So we're grateful for you taking the time to join us on this show and for all the work you're doing. And I hope everyone listening goes and checks out Chasing Justice and the work they're doing. They have an amazing Advent guide, which we have shared already as well. Please get plugged into their amazing work. But before we close, Sandra, any final words for our network?
Yeah, I just want to encourage you with the words that you all spoke earlier about the opportunity that we have when we confront what's actually happening in the world. I think that I have never felt oppressed by new knowledge of injustice in the world and my complicity in it. I've always felt like it's an opportunity to come closer to Jesus and to be more like Christ when I realize something is not as it should be. And if we recognize that justice is the pursuit of making right the wrongs in the world, if we understand that the pursuit of justice is really just wanting to see the world as it should be, as God created it to be, then when we're confronted with the way when it's not that way, then the opportunity presents itself to say, well, then what can I do about it? How can I imagine it being different? And how can I utilize my energy and my gifts and my talents to make that happen in the world? And even as a parent, I think about that all the time. Like when I'm teaching my kids about what's happening in Palestine or Syria or wherever it is I'm learning about or going to, and I'm sharing with them, like, we can make a difference. We can use our resources. We can use our gifts. We can use our minds. We can use our talents because Jesus invites us to make a difference in the world. And I don't think they feel overwhelmed by it. I think they feel agency. That's what you said, Sarah. They feel agency. Like, I can do something about this. And we should all feel that way. My deepest sadness as a pastor and as a leader is when people want to silence disruption because it makes them uncomfortable. It's very sad for me when I see people saying, I think, we're doing pretty good. And, we have some problems in the church, but we should, we can just do a little better. I'm like, no, we have some serious issues. Like, we have some serious discipleship issues we need to look at. And it's not to disrupt or to condemn, but it's to invite freedom. It's to invite liberation. It's to invite newness. And in order to do that, we need to look at things the way they are. And so I know that disruptors aren't always loved in spaces and places, but I think if we are to do our jobs well, I'm speaking to disruptors now, our words should actually invite hope and opportunity for a new world and a new place and a new way of being in the world. And so that's my hope for Chasing Justice is, yeah, we're pretty prophetic. We're pretty bold. We try to say things how it is. And also, I think we're optimistic. I think we're hopeful. And we want to see this come out in ways that are beautiful and imaginative and creative. I think that's what I want to leave people with. Like, if when you hear about things, when you turn on the news, the only thing you see is like, oh gosh, another thing to do, then invite more imagination into that. Like, what is the one thing I can do? What is one next step I can do? And then you find yourself kind of in really strange places 10 years from then. You're like, oh, how did I get in this room doing this thing? Like, how am I on this plane going to a place of conflict? Like, how is this happening? And you're like, oh, because I opened my heart. I opened my heart. And this is where Jesus led me. And that's the beauty, I think, of the Christian faith. And I think that's the beauty of those of us that are seeking and longing for more than this world is offering, is we have an opportunity to open our hearts. And it will take us on an adventure.
I love that. And one of the things that we often try to communicate is that this telos of where we're headed ultimately is that if it is liberation and healing, it's also joy. And that to get to that joy, you have to go through the discomfort. There has to be the time in the wilderness, right? Of disorientation before you can find your way back into reorientation into this land where you're going. And so that joy is this goal that we get to share and get to look forward to, and what you're inviting us into. So thank you for that, Sandra. Folks, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, as always, please rate and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And I know both Chasing Justice and Telos are raising funds for end of year campaigns. Consider giving to these organizations that are trying to build this imagination of wholeness and healing and even possibly joy in this world. So, folks, we're grateful that you tuned in this time, and we will see you next episode.